Hello, everyone, and good evening to our panelists coming to us live from Jerusalem. And welcome to this webinar on the new Israeli government organized by the Jewish Federations of North America, together with the Israel Democracy Institute. I'm Julie Platt, the chair of our Board of Trustees, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this first in a series of webinars that will be held over the coming weeks on this important topic. As you know, exactly 1 week ago, a new government was formed in Israel, led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. We were pleased to congratulate the Prime Minister on this achievement. We have had a long and fruitful relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu, dating back decades, and we look forward to working with him and the new government to support the growth and vitality of the Jewish state and to strengthen the relationships between Israel and the North American Jewish community. Indeed, our commitment to strengthening the ties between Israel and North American Jewry is an eternal one, and the bonds that unite our two communities are unbreakable. Our love and commitment to the Jewish state transcends any one government and any one point in time. However, in this government transition, there have been significant concerns over statements and positions held by some members of the incoming coalition, which have serious implications for our Jewish communities. Our objective is to work together with the government to address these issues of concern, some of which have been part of the dialogue between Israel and North American Jewry for many years. To that end, the first step is to educate ourselves on the current perspectives and context in which these issues are coming to the forefront. Today, we are privileged to host this special session in partnership with the Israel Democracy Institute. Let me begin by introducing three experts who are sitting together live in the Israel Democracy Institute's George Shultz conference room in Jerusalem. Actually, I believe there are two live and one in Jerusalem on Zoom with us. First, I am pleased to introduce a wonderful partner of the Jewish Federation system, the Israel Democracy Institute's president, Yohanan Plesner, a former member of Knesset. With him is Professor Susie Navot, who is a vice president at the Israel Democracy Institute and a specialist in Israeli constitutional law. Finally, well known to most of us, is the president and CEO of the Jewish Federations of North America, Eric Fingerhut, who is himself a former member of the US Congress, who will moderate our discussion. Over to you, Eric.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks to everyone for joining us. Yohanan, thank you for welcoming us to your beautiful facility and for your wonderful partnership. And Susie, thank you for joining us as well. Let's jump.
Just so great to host you here and hope that it will continue.
Thank you. We're glad to be here. Let's just jump right in because these are all top of mind issues. So first, we know this government was formed after the results of Israel's fifth election since 2019. Yeah. So the first question we have is the crisis over? Is the electoral crisis over? Is this a stable government? Is this government going to serve its term?
Well, the crisis is over in the sense that it seems like we're going to have a relatively stable government that is expected to hold together for 3 or 4 years. I cannot say that the political crisis is over, given the kind of things that we're going to hear right now as we speak from the Justice Minister, for example, presenting the new plan for quote unquote, some would say reform, some would call it a complete judicial overhaul or erosion of the independent judiciary. And in this respect, if indeed the Justice Minister, as we speak, will present such a radical plan, it will not constitute an end of the political crisis. It will end the political crisis in the sense of consecutive elections, but not in terms of the levels of division, dispute, and tension within Israeli society.
And so we're going to come back to the judicial reform issue in a second. Susie, that's going to come to you. But for those who may not have read the news yet, ripped from the headlines, what you're referring to is even as we're meeting here at exactly this moment over at the Knesset, the leadership of the coalition on this subject matter are introducing the judicial reform plan. So we're going to come back to that. But I want to say, every pretty much every article that we've read about this government uses the phrase, "This is the most right-wing government in Israel's history." First of all, what does that mean even? Is that an accurate description? What's the substance that makes something the most right-wing government? And if it's true, how do you explain that that's the result after 5 consecutive elections? How do you explain that the result would be the most right-wing instead of something that is more in the middle that brings people together that have been so divided?
Well, excellent questions.
Thank you.
So, first of all, the outcome in the Knesset is Netanyahu. The Netanyahu bloc has 64 seats out of 120, and the anti-Netanyahu bloc has 56. I'm using the term Netanyahu bloc and anti-Netanyahu because the terms right, left, and center have been completely skewed over the past few years and transformed and changed to the effect that they're almost meaningless by now. And I'll touch upon it in a sec. Now, 2.3 million Israelis voted for each of the blocs. So in a sense, we're split, and for the past 4 years we've been split right down by the middle between those two blocks, and we continue to be split as a result of the fact that two relatively large factions on the anti-Netanyahu bloc did not cross the threshold. About 6% of that side of the votes went down the drain, and that created the relatively stable outcome for the pro-Netanyahu camp. So in terms of public opinion, both blocs received about 49% of the vote, or 49 and something, and 48 point something, very high. But in terms of the outcome in the Knesset, it's actually different. Now, the definition that you use, the most right-wing government, I'm not sure that it's something that is a workable definition. I would probably, a more accurate definition would be the government with the strongest Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox presence. So out of 64, we have 32 members of Knesset, so exactly half of the coalition representing Orthodox parties, but 18 out of the 32 are ultra-Orthodox parties, which is, very large proportion. 14 are the far-right religious Zionist party, but it's actually not the classical, more moderate Mafdal or even the Bennett version of the national religious sector, but rather a sector, what we call in Hebrew, Chagdalim, say much more extreme version and interpretation of orthodoxy. So this is one element, a much more orthodox and religious coalition. And the Likud itself, that is the other half of the coalition, went through a transformation in the sense that many of the more liberal elements within the Likud have been weakened or left, like Gidon Sa'ar and others. And in this respect, it's a different kind of Likud. So the overall outcome is a coalition with much less constraints, much less inhibitions in some policy areas, and probably you're going to ask which in a moment.
I'm going to in a moment. And Susie, hang in, because we're coming to the judicial reform issue in just a second. But I have to ask you, Yohanan, because you just raised this issue of the growth of the religious parties and the Haredi parties, and another ripped from the headlines. This is literally on if anybody opens their phones to the Times of Israel homepage, they'll see a headline right now that says 70% of secular Jewish Israelis feel threatened by new government, survey shows. And if you click on it, lo and behold, this is a survey of the Israel Democracy Institute that you just published today. So I assume there's a relationship between what you just described about the makeup of this coalition and the growth of religious parties and this result of the secular Israelis. So why do they feel threatened? Why do secular Israelis feel threatened? And what is the political consequence of that fact?
Well, as it was mentioned in our sort of conversation before this online discussion, the ultra-Orthodox parties have been pretty much consecutively part of power since 1977, since the first Begin government. They had short periods where they were out of coalition. So one would say, what's new? But there is something new. They came to this government larger, 18 seats, with a greater appetite. They've been out of power for the past year and a half in the Bennett-Lapid government. Mr. Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, has no option other than including those parties in his coalition, because of the nature of the division and the political deadlock and the political crisis that we had. The Netanyahu bloc is a coherent, cohesive bloc without, there's no room for it to go in or out. So the ultra-Orthodox factions understand that Netanyahu needs them, and he has no other options and no other alternatives. In the past, there was always the threat, well, if you exaggerate, I can bring in a centrist party. There were also in the past, in past coalitions, parties like Mr. Lieberman's party, in the past right-wing coalitions led by Netanyahu, that represented mainly and largely the Russian minority, or immigrants from the former Soviet Union, and they have more liberal views on some of the religion and state matters. Here in this coalition, the ultra-Orthodox have disproportionate power, no options for Netanyahu, and no constraining political factions from within the coalition. And this means that policy-wise, this government, at least as reflected in the coalition agreement, is going to demonstrate a change of trajectory, of national trajectory with respect to a government policy vis-a-vis the ultra-Orthodox community. More budgets, less supervision, and more, say, ultra-Orthodox demands in the public sphere. And this explains the fear of 70% of secular Israelis who are saying, hey, this is not the kind of country that I've known, and they're fearful of their actual, rights and surroundings. And, they're, Eric, a really brief example. In the coalition agreements, there is a clause speaking about segregated areas in the public sphere. Segregated means women-free areas, or segregation between men and women in the public sphere, to make it constitutionally legal. This is something that in Israel that we haven't known if it will be. And another thing, discrimination in providing services, again, on the basis of religious faith. So if I hold the religious belief that gays are something that shouldn't be part of the public sphere, I can not provide them with a service. This is in the coalition agreement.
So I hope before this webinar is over, we'll have a chance to ask and answer the question, in your opinion, of how does the public reaction to this change or impact the government's actions when you have this form of coalition? Because surely there's the 70%, et cetera, will have an impact on this. But I do want to go to Susie, because you mentioned a constitutional issue already with respect to the issue of separation of gender in public accommodations. So Susie, ripped from the headlines, government to unfurl sweeping court reform plan, setting up showdown with judiciary. And right below that headline is a second headline that says Gantz, meaning Benny Gantz, of course, one of the opposition leaders, quoting Gantz, the coalition's judicial overhaul bid is a political coup. This is very, very strong language. So, Susie, what's going on here? What is the goal of the coalition? Why are people so concerned about it? And if you would share, if you have a prediction as to what's going to happen, is this just going to move through? This is the first major legislative priority of the coalition, and we should just expect that it's going to pass? That's a question.
Okay, that's a question. Well, let me give you the short answer. The short answer is, if they want to, they may pass it, because it's very easy in Israel. What they want, what we hear now at this very moment, is that the government wants legislation that would enable the Knesset to override decisions of the Supreme Court. They want what we call the override clause. They would like also to change the way that we elect judges. And they want no limitation whatsoever on the power of the Knesset to pass any law, and no limitation on the power of the government to decide whatever they want. So this is a major change in the constitutional system of Israel. And what I think is very interesting and important to understand is that Israel is very different to any other democracy. We have no real checks and balances between the branches. The judiciary is almost the only branch that may limit the power of the government, meaning to limit the power of the majority. You know, like in the United States and in many other countries, you have mechanisms, you have tools that decentralize political power. You have checks and balances, you have a rigid constitution, like in the United States, you have the splitting of the legislative authority into two houses, you have the right of veto on legislation given to a president. Our countries have also a federal structure, a regional electoral system, and even in Europe, you have international organizations and international courts. Now, none of this exists in Israel. And what does it mean? It means that majority rules, meaning that any ordinary majority of the Knesset may enact and amend any law or any basic law. It means that the politicians now, they have the possibility by a majority of 61 to change completely the rules of the game, the constitutional structure, the system of government. So this is what we see now. Okay, they want to legislate and to change the system of appointing judges, for example, which would change completely and even, I think, limit.
Well, let's can I probe on that just for a second? I'm sorry to interrupt you, but change the method of appointing judges from what to what. And in that context, you know, most of our viewers are, I think, coming from the US, though we have many from Canada. I am not an expert on how Canada appoints judges, but I remember from my US government classes that what we do at least in the federal court, is the president nominates, and then the Congress either approves or does not approve of the nomination. And in fact, Susie, I'm sure you know this, in the last few presidential elections, the makeup of the Supreme Court and frankly, elections for the U.S. Senate has been a major issue because people understood that the political outcome of elections was in fact going to affect the court. So help me understand the Israeli system in relation to what we are familiar with.
Okay, we have a committee for the selection of judges. It's a committee of 9, and it's very easy to remember. It's 2, 2, 2, 3. We have 2 ministers, meaning representing the government. We have 2 members of the Knesset representing the legislative branch. Usually, one is from the coalition and one is from the opposition, but it's not always like this. We have another two members of the Israeli bar, which is a professional branch. And we have 3 judges of the Supreme Court. All of them comprise a committee for the selection of judges. Now, in order to elect a Supreme Court judge, you need a majority of 7 out of 9, which means in Israel that we need a compromise between the politicians and the judges. We need a compromise between the professional and the political. And that's the only thing that we have to protect the independence of the judges, because we do not have a constitutional protection of the judiciary. The powers of the court are settled in a basic law that you can amend by a simple majority of 2 versus 1. If you want to make the Supreme Court disappear, you only need a 3 readings bill passed by a simple majority of the Knesset. We do not have the tenure of the judges with a constitutional protection. Everything can be really changed. Okay, can be changed very easily. So I think that our system, which actually needs for this compromise, is very good and suitable for Israel, because we do not have other checks and balances, and we need the Supreme Court to be independent and professional and not political.
Can you give us an example? Obviously, this is on the agenda of the coalition for a reason, right? There must have been decisions of the court overruling or declaring unconstitutional pieces of legislation that they would like to see enacted. What's this all about, really? Is it about what we would call church and state? Is it about religious affairs? Is it about, Yohanan talked about gender issues? Is it about conversion? What's this about, really? Why are we fighting about this?
I do not think that it's a very good question, Eric, but I do not think that we have one trigger. Perhaps Yohanan can elaborate on that. I think that the idea is the idea of power. We want power and do not want any limitation on this power. If we want to give exemption to enrolling in the army of the religious Orthodox, we want to do that. And we do not want the court to say that it is against the principle of equality. If we want to if we want to implement in Israel the idea of equal but separate, then we do not want the court to interfere in that. And if the court will interfere, we want to override it. We want.
Those are real. You're giving real examples. You didn't make those up, right? Those are real examples of things that you believe might come
one
forward.
of them is real, of course, the exemption, and the second one is not real, but it's the one that Yohanan spoke before. The idea of if we want to make separations, in the public sphere between women and men, we do not want the court to see this as a discrimination.
But Susie, it is real because it appears in the coalition agreements.
Exactly.
So it's
okay. Well, it doesn't. It did not happen yet.
It's not science fiction.
It's not.
I'd like to try and answer your question on. First of all, the comparison between Israel and the U.S. on the system of election of judges is obviously flawed because of the reasons that Susie mentioned. But also, we do not have a constitution. We do not have a Bill of Rights. So the role of if you fully politicize also the appointment of judges at the same time as you can, all rights can be taken or removed or changed by the same group of politicians that both nominate the judges, decide on the rights, decide on the questions of separation of power, and everything is up for grabs. And in our political culture, when you are able to do something, there are no normative constraints from actually doing it. This is a bad idea. We also have to remember that the courts, their bread and butter is not to deal with constitutional matters and questions of separation of powers, but rather they are also a professional system that delivers justice. And you do not want it, all decisions of even in lower courts made by politicians. And my cousin and my uncle, and I've been to politics, I've been a member of Knesset for 6 years. I know how pressure on politicians, especially in primaries, parties with primaries, how it looks like when people know that you have a certain amount of power. So I wouldn't want to put the politicians under this test. So this is about electing judges. Now,
but wait, let me say something about it, Yohanan, that
Yes,
just to
please.
add something to what you said. In Israel, the High Court is also the Supreme Court of Appeals, which actually means that there is an overflow of cases. Okay. Our Supreme Court does not elect or choose the cases it wants to hear. Every case that starts in the district court in Israel may be appealed to the Supreme Court. We are talking about thousands of cases that need, for professional judges and not political judges. We do not have a constitutional court because we do not have a rigid constitution. Perhaps if one day Israel will have a constitution, then we may speak about, okay, let's talk about a constitutional court, that the judges would be elected in a different way. But this is not the case in Israel. So that's the point that I wanted to add to what you said.
So let me ask you about a couple of specific issues, and I wonder whether they fall under the category of something that might end up at the court, or just these are coalition only issues. The law of return. This is something that holds a emotional resonance in the Jews around the world. It in some ways it's the tether of our connection, or the manifestation, if you will, of our connection, and it seems that the coalition wants to make changes. Now, to be fair, the Likud, at least the Prime Minister Netanyahu, says he doesn't want to make changes, but yet we hear from ministers who control certain ministries that they want to make those changes. So say more about that issue.
Yeah, but first of all, Since I've been a day or two, been around the block, I look at what appears in the coalition agreements as a better indication than sort of hollow statements. And the coalition agreements now indicate that there is an intention to change the law of return. Again, I'm actually quite hopeful, and here I'm.
Well, it says, if I understood correctly, it says there's going to be a committee to discuss.
Yeah.
And by the way, I do have to say that the prime minister says coalition agreements aren't more important than we'll sign a coalition agreement to get to government. Once I'm in government, that's what really matters.
Yeah, but when you have a government with a few factions, and each faction, if it pulls out of the coalition, it topples the government. The point of equilibrium that holds this thing politically together is the coalition agreement. This is what the document that you go back to when there's a dispute, and we've seen that in political conduct. Having said that, it's true that not everything that appears in coalition agreements is actually implemented later on, and historically we've seen that sort of a good majority of the agreements were implemented, and some were not, and it's not a legally binding document. Although it's called an agreement, it's basically like a sort of expectations management. It has
I interrupted the law of return discussion.
Yeah. So in terms of a law of return, in the past in Israel, the court played an important role, obviously, in basically affecting the political system, and for example, recognizing non-Orthodox conversions for the purpose of application in the law of return, and for being able to be registered in Israel, at least in the state registry as a Jew. So that was a court decision. So I would have two things to say about the law of return. Do I think it will change? I have given my political experience, the fact that they said that a committee will be established, I feel that, given enough pressure from the other half of the Jewish people, the government will decide to sort of not deal with that issue, to sort of.
You do think that if we're able to communicate that this is a matter of utmost concern to the Jews outside of Israel, that will have an impact?
I think that if there will be sort of no objection, and it seems like nobody really cares, then it will be easier to go ahead with a coalition agreement. But if there'll be counter pressure, I don't think it's on the top of the priority of any of the parties that form the coalition. Of course, the ultra-Orthodox would prefer to change the law of return, but it's not in their top 10 list of issues. Now, the law of return, other changes that the court made in the past also had to do with led to the Kotel compromise, for example. So the court played an important role because it's committed to one principle that is called equality in access to government, to public resources, to government services, and so on. So the court played an important role for many constituencies, like in gender matters, in matters of non-Orthodox streams of Judaism, that to get I would say a more decent and more equitable, if not to say equal, attitude by the government, and so on. So in this respect, those who want to crush the court, they're not interested in the court as an institution. They're interested in concentrating all power in the political sphere, where they believe they have a greater chance to have a majority over time.
So you don't think that the law of return is necessarily on the top priority list, but that speaking up about it nevertheless is important.
Very important.
Let me ask about another issue, and Susie, because you're not sitting at the table with me, feel free to jump in anytime.
It's okay.
On any issue. Another issue that feels that it has this lack of consensus, of tension, is the issue of LGBTQ rights. So first we had the decision to appoint the representative of the Noam party, Mr. Maoz, to this deputy position in the prime minister's office with a budget, controlling identity. He, of course, has been notoriously anti the gay and lesbian LGBTQ community. At the same time that the prime minister put him in that position, he said to the American press, especially, "Don't worry, there won't be any changes." And then very importantly, appointed Yohanan, the first openly gay Speaker of the Knesset. And Speaker of Knesset is a very important, influential position. By the way, at least you have a Speaker of the Knesset. If we're paying attention to, if anybody's watching American news right now, let me know if we have. I don't think we yet have a Speaker of the House. So Israel isn't the only place with contentious coalition politics being at play. But how should we think about this issue, the LGBTQ rights issue with respect to this coalition?
Well, let's start with the coalition agreements. I'll start with the bad news and move to the good news.
Okay.
The coalition agreements determine or stipulate that it will be an option, or we will legislate an option for businesses to provide discriminate in providing service. So in other words, if I have an event venue and a gay couple wants to get married, I can say, no, it's against my faith. Please look for another hall or something of that sort. So this appears in the coalition agreement. At the same time, there are the public pronouncements of the prime minister. We will not discriminate, but he signed, his name and his signature appears on that very agreement. So that means that now this issue hasn't been decided yet. Obviously, if there's a functioning court that is not stripped of its authorities, it will probably strike down such a discriminatory legislation. So but if the court will be weakened or eroded or crushed, it won't be there in order to provide this service to Israeli society. Now, I said I'll start with this sort of a more questionable side and end up with something that, at least from my perspective, is somewhat more upbeat. What happens when we look at what the Israeli people think? So the Israelis, we voted in the election, as I mentioned before, 49 pro and against the Netanyahu bloc. But when we look at the actual issues, so how many Israelis support canceling a recognition of a reform or non-Orthodox conversions for the law of return? Only 30% support it, which means a tiny fraction, a small fraction of Israelis. How many believe that the grandchild clause should be canceled in the law of return? 29% of Israelis. So there's a tiny majority supporting those initiatives that, even though they appear in the coalition agreements, not everybody that voted for the Netanyahu bloc voted for these things. How many Israelis support separation between men and women at public events to make it legal, this discrimination between men and women? Only 28%. Mainly those percentages are largely religious, mainly ultra-Orthodox and some national religious, but a vast majority of traditional and secular Israelis oppose it, and a vast majority of Israelis oppose these pieces of legislation.
So let me add to that something.
Just one word: we should not look at Justice Minister Levin and the new Constitution Committee leader Rotman. Both are very, very able and smart politicians, but very much at the fringe of Israeli politics. We should not look at them and imagine that they're now representing a majority of Israelis.
Susie, you want to get in?
Yes, I wanted to only to add something about the new Knesset Speaker as a gay and the power to stop any LGBTQ legislation. I do not see this legislation actually coming over. I do not see it, because it's an issue that is very sensitive in Israel, and it's something that is tangible. You can touch it. You see it. You see what it means to a gay, and the gays are on the television, also the lesbian, etc. It's much easier for the government to deal with reforms that perhaps some of the people do not understand. Like when you said we are going to pass an override clause, it's not like we are going to discriminate the gays. It's completely different. And I think this perception of what the people think is very important also to the new government. So it will be much easier to pass this override clause, which is actually much more dangerous than any legislation on gays, because the people, not all the people of Israel, understand what is at stake actually. And this is one of our problems concerning this new judicial reform, that not everybody actually really
More
understands.
difficult to talk about the abstract institutional
Right.
matters rather than, specific people.
I understand. So we've been getting questions from the audience. My good colleague, Danny Wasser, has been collecting them. Many of them have been repeated in different forms. So we've kind of consolidated a few of them together. I want to go to them now, and then, we'll see how much time we have to continue our discussion. So the first question was that a few people have asked about the demographics in Israel. What percentage of Jewish Israelis consider themselves secular? We talked about before, 70% of seculars said they feel under threat. So is that the tiny percentage? Is that a large percentage? And how do others define themselves?
Yohanan, this is for you.
Okay. Susie and myself are like Mickey Berkovich and Moti Arwesti, and the two basketball players. So about 13% of Israelis are defined as ultra-Orthodox. It's obviously a population in a large demographic growth. About a decade ago, they were 10%. Now they're 13%. And by 2030, they're expected to be about 16%. So this is the equivalent of, we don't have massive immigration. We do have some immigration, and now more from Russia and Ukraine, but the equivalent of what immigration does in places like the US, that causes sort of demographic changes and threats to people's identity. The equivalent is the massive, quite dramatic growth of the ultra-Orthodox community. So 13% currently, but there's a demographic vector there. About 12% define themselves as national religious. So altogether, about a quarter of Israelis define themselves as religious. About 20% are of the Arab minority, although about 2.5% of them are from East Jerusalem. So they are permanent residents, but not citizens, say for the, so they do not vote and so on. So from politically speaking, about 17% are citizens that vote, and the remaining part of the population is secular and traditional. So it adds up to about 55%. I say secular and traditional because there are, differences. And actually, I'm sorry, it's actually a larger number because the 20% Arab are not. I misstated, when we look at the numbers of ultra-Orthodox and so on, it's out of the Jewish population. So it's actually a larger, so there's still a majority of traditional and secular, but there are nuances. When we say traditional in Israel, it's not Masorti as in the US. It's some of the traditional tend to sort of adopt some of the more Orthodox views on issues, and some tend to be more secular. So
I have two follow-up questions, Yohanan. One is, you mentioned, and I'm going to ask them both at the same time. You can maybe answer them together or separate as you choose. You brought up the Arab population. That's the first time that's come up in this conversation today. And we do have a question about how will the new government's policies impact Arab Israelis. And of course, I can say, certainly coming from North America, the issue of what we call shared society, Israel as a democracy of all of its citizens, is something that has always been is aspirational and part of our love of Israel. So say something about that. And then, in light of the demographics that you've described, yet we had the electoral outcomes that we have and the coalition that we have. What really was in people's minds in this election? We have elections in America where there's a lot of issues going on, and it turns out that one rose was more important than others. I mean, for example, we just, in this most recent election, the issue of reproductive rights for women might not have been on anybody's agenda a year ago, but because of the Supreme Court decision, it was, and it clearly helped drive, in many respects, the outcome of the election. So say something about Arab Israelis and the new government and shared society, and say something about what was really driving in your mind.
I don't know if
voters.
it's coincidental or incidental, but the two questions are tied together, because the real issue that it appears that drove Israelis to vote this time was the difficulty of a large percentage of Israelis to digest the fact that we had for the first time a party representing the Arab minority in the coalition. So the Mansour Abbas Ra'am party, an Islamist party, was part of the Bennett-Lapid coalition. For the first time, an Arab party in the coalition, and that was too difficult to digest for too many Israelis, especially given two facts. Fact number one, there was a rise in terror attacks, and terror attacks perpetrated also within Israel proper, Tel Aviv, Bnei Brak, Jerusalem, etc. So the fact that there was a rise in terror, rise in crime, and a lot of it originating from the Arab sector in Israel, demanding protection. Like some figures that more than half of contractors find themselves in contractors in construction sites find themselves having to pay off protection, mainly for criminals from the Arab sector. So the sense that there's more crime coming from the Arab sector, more terror coming from Palestinian/Arab sector, and an Islamist party in the government, and all these dots were connected to the extent that the narrative was the Islamists are in power and the government's hands are tied and is not able to fight against terror. This narrative was extremely powerful, drove Israelis to say we should end that, even if it means paying more to the ultra-Orthodox or something, we should defend the Jewish state, the Jewish values, and so on. So this was really the issue. Now, this is about the political aspect.
Is that what drove the party that led by Ben Gvir's numbers?
Very much so. His slogan was, we are going to demonstrate who is the landlord. The landlord, i.e. the Jewish landlord. So now, Ben Gvir, it's true, shed light on a genuine issue that is troubling many Israelis. The rise of crime is a real issue that needs to be dealt with. Both crime within the biggest victims of the rise of crime are the Arab citizens themselves, where there's higher rates of murder within Arab towns and villages, within Israel proper. So there's a real issue. But Ben Gvir demonstrated political skill and to some extent also lack of inhibitions and constraints in politicizing this issue and saying, well, the reason why there's a rise in crime is because there's an Islamist party in the government, and therefore we need to free the government and allow policemen to sort of open up fire more easily and so on. So he came up with simple solutions for very complex problems, but it caught fire.
I want to stay on this. I want to stay on this for a second, and I'm going to just bare my soul a little bit, which is to say that I've had many of my Israeli friends, when we express concerns about this coalition, as Julie Platt did at the beginning of the webinar, they say, but you didn't express concerns when the previous coalition had the Islamist party, the Ram party, Mansour Abbas in it. And so here's the there's the soul-bearing part. I certainly, for me, and I think for many who are American in our sensibilities, we saw that as a positive. In fact, it made us proud that in a Jewish state, there was an Arab party that was holding a position of power, but serving as a minority in a government of a Jewish majority. And on the other hand, certainly the concerns you've expressed about crime, et cetera, are also concerns, that we hold. But to the extent that we were hearing in North America that the campaign was against Arabs being in government, that was that
Difficult to
really, it's
digest.
difficult to digest. It comes close to race, racial issues, and doesn't fulfill our vision of Israeli democracy. So I'm just telling you what an American,
So let me.
what a democratic, American Jew,
Yeah.
how we heard that. Help us understand, because that's not what we want to believe about Israeli
Well,
democracy.
let me come up with a complex answer. I mean, the fact that a large number of Israelis found it very difficult to digest an Islamic party in the government, on the one hand, is reflects what you said, a sense of disappointment. Wait, it's an opportunity. We want to integrate. We want to. And Mansour Abbas is actually a politician that, if I had to program in a sort of application, how would I want a Arab political leader to sort of conduct himself? So he accepted Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. He condemned acts of terror against Israelis. He focused not on the Palestinians, but rather on tangible day-to-day challenges of Israeli Arabs, which is, what we've always wanted, such an Arab politician, and he got real support for that. So it was opening an avenue, a new avenue, hopefully new era of integration. And frankly, I also, like you, I thought that it's good news. Now, for the benefit, or to be fair to the amount of Israelis that were, to those many Israelis that were against it. First of all, we have a different situation in the US. Israel is still in an active conflict with the Palestinians. Hamas is still shooting missiles and going into rounds of violence against us. And there are acts of terror, hundreds of acts of terror planned by terrorists, both in the West Bank and in Gaza every year. The vast majority are eliminated by the Shin Bet and the IDF and so on, but there are hundreds of acts of terror trying to kill Israelis perpetrated by Palestinian organizations. So there's an active conflict with the Palestinians. Now, Israeli Arabs, 20% of our population, we want to treat them fairly, but at the same time, a component of their identity is Palestinian. They see the Palestinians as their cousins, as their family, as part of their identity, and it's legitimate. It's it's the same people that a rigid border was separated them in 1948. Now, so for many Israelis, it's difficult to digest the fact that, on the one hand, you feel that our enemy is your family or something, and at the same time you want to be in the government that has to make decisions of war and peace. The Bennett-Lapid government took on Hamas in a conflict, and Israelis said, now their survival depends on Abbas. Will they think twice before they eliminate the next Hamas terrorist? So what I'm trying to bring across is that it's not about racism per se. It's about a real dilemma and real difficulty. And when you look at, which I'm not trying to some extent, I'm not presenting this view because I support it, but I can understand, and I think it's a legitimate concern. And when and at the same time, the plans to integrate the Arab minority in terms of pouring billions of shekels started in the previous Netanyahu government. There was a 5-year plan passed in, I think, 2016. IDI, our institution, was very much a part of helping the nitty-gritty details of how to allocate those funds. But there was a 15 billion shekel additional supplementary plan for pouring into to increase equality, economic opportunity, social mobility, and so on. And the Bennett-Lapid government turned it into a 5-year plan of 30 billion shekels. So they also did it. But the Israelis, when we look at the figures, are fine with economic investment in the Arab minority, but are skeptical when it comes to Arab leaders taking part in decision-making, in national level decision-making, because of the conflict.
So that actually very helpful answer, Yohanan. Thank you. So I'm going to ask both of you together the final two questions together, and we have just a few minutes to answer them. On the questions that we've been submitted by the audience, I don't know if they're joking, but it says a simple question: is Israel democracy under threat? I don't know that that's a simple question, but I'll let each of you take. But I'm going to add to it if I can, because earlier when we were talking about the law of return, you said that our input from North America and from the world could be decisive. I'd like you to also, as you're answering the question about Israeli democracy, and I, this is the Israeli Democracy Institute, so I assume you both have an opinion on the subject. Also, how would you guide us, not just on the law of return, but on these other issues coming? Because as you know so well, not only do we love Israel and care about Israel's success and are tied to it and bound to it deep in our hearts and our souls, but also it dominates American political discussion, and we're constantly, called upon to talk with our elected officials and other leaders about these issues. So, how would you guide us as we approach this government in the coming months and years? Susie, you've been because you're not at the table, you've been at a disadvantage. So I'm going to go to you first, and then we'll give.
So I suggest
Yohanan
Susie will answer on are we under threat, and I will answer about the guidance.
Okay, Susie.
Okay, but if you allow me, I will tie the question on our democracy is under threat with a question that has been posed before. I have the chat here, and I think it's a very good question, and I think that they're both linked. And the question is whether we have basic laws that can be repealed or amended by a supermajority, meaning by 80 MKs, which potentially leave them beyond the reach of a coalition government. And this is a very good question because, first of all, the answer is, unfortunately, the answer is no. And that's one of our problems, that nothing is real secured, not the branches of government, not the Knesset, not the way the Knesset actually acts, not the way the government is formed. We even changed the basic law on the government 2 days before the government was sworn, because the government needed a change in this constitutional law in order to allow one of the ministers that was not actually eligible for the post in order to serve. And this is tomorrow we will hear the case. So the unbearable lightness in which our basic laws may be changed is one of the problems of our democracy. It's a very weak democracy, and therefore the simple question is our democracy under threat? I hope not, but I'm afraid it is, because the easiness in which a minister of justice may come forward and say, okay, we want to change everything. We want the absolute power to rule. We want 61 to be able to do anything, meaning even to infringe upon our human rights if the Knesset wants so, because no more demonstrations in the street, for example, or several demonstrations will not be allowed. If the majority wants it may happen, and that is the difference between, I think, Israel and any other country.
And
so
just as a quick follow-up, and then to Yohanan, if 61 does something that only 20% or 30%, according to Yohanan's earlier statistics, supports, will there not be a political backlash that will that in a democratic way will lead to change the government?
It's for me or for Yohanan?
I was looking still to you, but either one.
No, but I thought that Yohanan would. Okay, no problem.
Yohanan could take it.
Vaksha, do you want to answer, Susie?
No, it's okay. If I will need to add something, I will.
The short answer is politics is indeed a pendulum, as you've seen also in America, but we do not think it's healthy that the basic questions of the character of the state, the nature of the regime will be, that half of the population plus one will force on the other half matters that have to do with the fundamental character and rights of the state, and then it will be changed. It's unstable. It's a recipe for a divided society and a sort of internal division that will not produce a positive outcome. So we think that on those fundamental questions of how should Israel's character as a Jewish and democratic state, how should the basic principles of separation of power, how should they operate, those should be agreed upon with a large consensus in a serious process that, obviously it will never be 120, like the Declaration of Independence had an absolute majority, but we want something that is close to that. And in this respect, we do not want politics to impinge on every aspect of life. I shouldn't be worried about my fundamental rights. Will they be protected or not, depending on who's in government? So we want to clear some aspects, and this is a fundamental feature of a democracy, that regardless of whoever is in government, my properties, my freedom of speech, my basic freedoms are all protected.
So in 90 seconds, advise us.
So two pieces of advice. Number one, Israel itself and a previous Netanyahu government legislated a constitutional legislation, a constitutional chapter, the nation state bill, that at a constitutional level defines Israel as a state of the Jewish people, also a Jewish and democratic state, a Jewish of the Jewish people. So by definition, constitutionally, members of the Jewish people have skin in the game, have a constitutional role, are part of this polity. Now, obviously, not in every issue at the same way, but of course, obviously, in questions that have to do directly with the Jewish people, like law of return, conversion, religion, and state, I think that clearly there's a role and a voice that should be made very clear. Also in questions that have to do with the fundamental feature of what the Jewish state is about in terms of separation of powers and basic rights, which are two basic features of every democracy, to ensure that Israel's democracy is not just majority rule or an authoritarian democracy, but rather a fully fledged democracy. In those issues, in those fundamental issues, I think it's very important for a Jewish community and Jewish leadership to have a voice. Because if it's an important part of your identity, then the basic character of the state, it matters to your identity as well. And of course, as those who sort of represent Israel and vouch for it in the American public and American political system, we know that this alliance that is critical for our survival, and I'll end with that, it depends on two anchors: shared values and shared interests. And if you change fundamentally erode Israeli democracy, you basically erode the shared values component, which is the component that is the most important component in the US-Israel relationship. And in this respect, it's a vital national interest. And I wouldn't sort of sit aside and say, well, it's for the Israelis to decide. You have skin in the game. You have to do it respectfully and respecting Israeli democracy, but finding an intelligent and effective way. And for that, there are leaders like you to make your voice heard.
And if you allow me another,
Yes,
just
Susie.
one question, just one sentence to finish. First of all, I agree completely with Yohanan, and it's not because he's my boss, but actually I do agree with both the ideas that, first of all, the values of Israel, it's a Jewish and democratic state. And I think no majority of 61 can change that. These are the values of the Declaration of Independence. These are fundamental values. And I think that the people of Israel, when they went to the elections, when they will go to the next elections, they do not grant the power to this elected majority or that elected majority of 61 to change our fundamental values. And I think this idea is very important to feel it and actually to act upon. Based on that
becomes the last word. Professor Susie Navot, thank you. Yohanan Plesner, the president of the Israel Democracy Institute, thank you for having us and for an enlightening conversation. And I'm pleased to turn it back to the chair of the Jewish Federations of North America, Julie Platt.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you to both of you so much. Listen, it's complicated in the best of times, And it's really complicated now. And we are so appreciative of your beginning the process with us, of helping us to understand the role we can play. So thank you. We look forward to working on more of these presentations in the coming weeks. And just a reminder to everybody that we are holding a webinar on January the 12th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time to discuss Israel and its LGBTQ community. Thank you all for joining us and wishing everyone a peaceful 2023.
Thank you. Yofi.